He went out to sea for the first time before he understood the weight of his own body, before he knew how to name fear or tell desire from necessity, and from that moment on, he repeated the gesture every day as one obeys a rhythm that precedes the will, a call that demands no courage because it allows no choice. Salt marked his skin early on, not as a wound but as a slow inscription, and the rocking of the hull became a natural extension of thought, until solid ground began to feel excessive, noisy, filled with rigid angles that taught nothing. At first, he believed the sea to be nothing more than brute force, a field of resistance where a man proves his worth by returning intact, a territory conquered with steady arms, alert eyes, and measured respect. He learned the currents, memorized the behavior of the tides, recognized in the scent of the wind the promise of change, and that was enough for him. Knowledge to him meant control. Silence was merely the absence of sound. Time was a patient enemy, stealing strength with every season. With the passing years, however, something began to shift within that simple understanding. Small dissonances appeared, almost imperceptible, like notes out of tune in an old melody. Waves rose where they should not, too high beneath a clear sky, pushing him away from familiar routes. Rain came suddenly, heavy and cold, when everything suggested calm, forcing him to retreat with the uneasy feeling of failure. The sea, which had always seemed predictable within its roughness, began to behave as if it were anticipating events he could not see. Every imposed detour, every forced return, was taken as an affront or a punishment, and the fisherman, hardened by repetition, answered by setting his jaw, reinforcing the belief that survival meant resistance. Yet there was an old shadow that followed every stroke of the oars, a memory that salt could not dissolve, a loss that had occurred many years earlier when the sea still seemed a proving ground rather than a language, had settled in him like a silent weight. He did not speak of it. He did not need to. Guilt, when deep, requires no words to make itself present. It filters the world, alters the meaning of signs, turns warning into accusation. And so, every sudden change in the weather sounded to him like judgment, every misplaced wave like a reminder of an error never fully named. The sea, in its mute vastness, became a cruel mirror of that memory, and the fisherman began to face it not only with his body, but with a contained resentment that he mistook for discipline. Silence, once merely part of the setting, began to take on another density. Between the creak of wood and the rhythmic strike of water, there were pauses too long to ignore, intervals in which the world seemed suspended, as though something were being said without sound. He did not know how to listen to that. He was used to interpreting only what could be measured, predicted, classified. Strength was familiar to him, care was not. When the sea drove him away, he read it as rejection. When it pushed him back toward shore, he felt diminished, as if he had failed an invisible test. It never occurred to him that resistance might be protection, that an obstacle could be a form of vigilance. Time, that voiceless judge, watched everything without intervening, gathering evidence the fisherman ignored. Years stacked like layers of varnish on the wood of the boat, darkening it, making it firmer, denser, and the same was happening within him. Daily discipline, imposed by necessity, shaped his body and his character, but also narrowed his capacity to listen. He knew how to act, not how to contemplate. He knew how to advance, not how to yield. The idea of limits seemed to him a weakness, when in truth it was a language he had not yet learned. Only when repetition began to trace patterns did the unease become impossible to ignore. Whenever he insisted on a certain route, something arose to divert him. Whenever he pushed forward on particular days, the sea grew heavier, more closed, forcing him to turn back. And, strangely, whenever he obeyed those detours, even in anger, he returned whole, while others, bolder or prouder, did not return at all. Even so, he attributed it to chance, to blind luck that chooses its victims without reason. The old pain would not allow him to see care where he recognized only force. The storm that changed everything did not arrive as a surprise, but as a confirmation. The sky darkened with a grave slowness. The wind shifted in an unfamiliar way, and the waves began to rise not in fury but in warning. There was a different cadence to them, a constant push away, like steady hands guiding someone out of a danger not yet revealed. For the first time the fisherman hesitated, not out of fear of the sea, but out of weariness from fighting something that seemed to know more than he did. He gathered the sails, let himself be carried by the movement he had always tried to overcome, and at the height of the storm, when strength could no longer be mistaken for hostility, something opened within his perception. There, between the crash of the water and the inner silence that finally took hold, he understood that every forced retreat, every ill-timed rain, every excessive wave had always been exactly where it needed to be to save him. The sea had never asked for submission, only for listening. It had never demanded dominion, only humble attention. The old loss he had carried as condemnation was not an accusation, but a reminder of the cost of not listening. The pain had not been punishment, but a rupture born of deafness. When he returned to the shore, there was no triumph, no sense of grand revelation, only a wider silence, less heavy. He walked along the sand with slow steps, feeling in his body the fatigue of someone who has finally stopped resisting what does not need to be conquered. The sea remained there, vast and indifferent to human narratives, singing in its ancient language of rhythm, diversion, and care. The fisherman no longer needed to translate it. It was enough to listen. And when he sat down, looking at the line where water meets land, he did not think of legacy or redemption or control. He thought only that understanding the world had never been about conquering it, but about accepting in silence the guidance of forces that do not shout, because they do not need to be heard by those who insist on dominance. Time went on passing, as it always had, and he let it pass, without the old urgency, like someone who understands that certain truths do not conclude in words, they simply fall silent once they have said all they can.